She is the one who killed her father. My mother's voice did not tremble when she said it. It carried cleanly across the dining room, over the crystal glasses and the polished silverware, over the hum of 28 Thanksgiving guests who had gathered in the house on Abercorn Street as they had every year since I was a child. The room went silent so fast it felt violent. A fork slipped from someone's hand and struck porcelain. A child near the end of the table whispered, "What does she mean?" and was hushed immediately. The scent of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes hung thick in the air, suddenly nauseating. I didn't move. My hands were folded in my lap beneath the tablecloth. They were shaking hard enough that my knuckles brushed against each other. But my face stayed still. I had learned that trick years ago. Caroline Reed, my mother, stood at the head of the table with her wine glass raised. She didn't look at anyone else. She looked at me. "In the last weeks of his life," she continued, her voice steady and measured, "Daniel told me things about pressure, about disappointment, about choices he made because he felt he had no other option." She let that settle. About me. The implication was clear before she said it out loud. She told them my father, Daniel Harper, dying of pancreatic cancer, had confessed regret, that he had felt manipulated, that he had been persuaded to refuse aggressive treatment too soon, that insurance money had been part of the conversation. There was even, she said, a recording, a final message he left behind. No one in that room had ever heard it, but she described it so vividly, so confidently, that for years people had stopped asking to. I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped across the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp in the silence. "If you want to tell the whole truth tonight, Mom," I said, my voice quieter than I expected, "then let's tell it." I didn't wait for her response. I stepped away from the table and walked toward the hallway that led to my father's old study. This accusation had not been born tonight. It had been cultivated for 17 years, since I was 15 and standing beside a hospital bed while my father decided how he wanted to die. In the beginning, it had been subtle. My mother saying he had been tired, that he had given up, that he had worried about me. The tone had shifted gradually, like weather turning cold 1 degree at a time. After he died, the words changed again. He expected more from you. He was disappointed. He felt pressured. No one ever asked pressured into what. It was implied. A year later, she married Thomas Reed, a real estate attorney with a polite smile and a son named Evan, who was only a year younger than me. My bedroom became Evan's. I moved into the converted laundry room downstairs. The relocation was explained as practical. It felt symbolic. The story about my father grew with time. My mother repeated it at church luncheons, in careful whispers to relatives, at family gatherings where grief was still a convenient shield. Thomas never confirmed it. He never denied it either. Silence, I learned, is its own kind of endorsement. By the time I graduated from architecture school in 2014, my mother didn't attend. She sent a text. Evan, meanwhile, received tuition, celebration, applause. And always there was that supposed recording, the one too painful to play, the one that contained my father's truth. I reached the study door now and paused with my hand on the handle. Behind me, I could hear murmurs rising from the dining room. My name floated through them. So did the word insurance. So did the word betrayal. They thought I was retreating. They thought I couldn't defend myself without anger. What they didn't know was that I had arrived early that afternoon, 30 minutes before the first guest knocked. I had walked into this room alone, knelt beside my father's old desk, and checked the bottom drawer. The tin box was still there. Cold metal met my fingers again as I opened the drawer now and wrapped my hand around it. When I lifted it out and turned back toward the dining room, I saw my mother standing at the end of the hallway. Her confidence flickered for the first time that night. She knew exactly what I was holding. I carried the tin box back into the dining room slowly, feeling every pair of eyes follow me. The turkey sat carved but untouched. The candles had burned lower. My mother was still standing at the head of the table, but her posture had shifted. The certainty in her shoulders had thinned. "This didn't start tonight," I said, setting the box down beside the serving platter. The metal made a hollow sound against the wood. "It started 17 years ago." I didn't open it yet. It started in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, with winter light coming through blinds that never seemed to open all the way. I was 15. My father was dying of late-stage pancreatic cancer. The doctors had explained the numbers in calm voices. Aggressive chemotherapy might buy time. It would not buy a cure. I sat beside him most afternoons after school. I did my homework in the corner chair. Sometimes he would fall asleep mid-sentence. Sometimes he would squeeze my hand like he was afraid of letting go. The first shift came quietly. One evening, after a long private conversation between my parents in the hallway outside his room, my mother came back in with red eyes and a tight jaw. She didn't look at me when she gathered her purse. She didn't speak on the drive home. Within weeks of his death, the language began to change. He was tired. He didn't want to fight anymore. He felt like he was disappointing everyone. At first it sounded like grief. It sounded like a widow trying to make sense of loss. Then it sharpened. He expected more from you. He worried about the choices you were encouraging. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon when she said, almost casually, "He told me things at the end, Olivia, things you might not want other people to know." I didn't know what she meant. I didn't ask. After the funeral, she took control of everything: paperwork, insurance forms, hospital files, conversations with relatives. I was 15 and exhausted. I let her. A year later, she married Thomas Reed. Thomas came with polished manners and a son named Evan. Evan was polite, quiet. He moved into the house like he had always belonged there. My bedroom became his within a week. "You're older," my mother said. "You don't need as much space." I moved into the converted laundry room downstairs. The ceiling was lower. The single window looked out at the side of the house where nothing grew. It wasn't just a change of room. It was a change of status. The story about my father evolved alongside the new marriage. At church gatherings, I would catch fragments of conversation. Daniel struggled at the end. He felt pressured. He wasn't himself. The first time she mentioned the recording, I was 17. She told an aunt that my father had left behind an audio message, that he had confessed his disappointment, that he had spoken about feeling pushed toward decisions he wasn't ready to make. "Someday," she said, "maybe I'll play it, but it's too painful right now." No one ever heard it, but they believed it. The more she described it, the more detailed it became. The pauses in his voice, the regret, the tone. It was vivid enough that people stopped questioning whether it existed. By the time I left for architecture school, the narrative was settled. My father had refused aggressive treatment. I had been closely involved in his final decisions. He had felt conflicted. He had felt influenced. No one ever said I killed him. They didn't need to. At my college graduation in 2014, my mother sent flowers but did not attend. Thomas had a closing that day, she said. Evan's business school tuition was fully paid. His achievements were celebrated loudly. When insurance money was mentioned in passing once at dinner, she glanced at me and said, "Not everything is about ambition." I learned to swallow my responses. I learned to measure my reactions. I learned that silence could be mistaken for guilt if you let it. 17 years passed like that. 17 years of careful whispers and careful looks. 17 years of a story repeated often enough that even I began to question my own memory of those hospital conversations. I looked around the dining room now at faces that had watched me grow up. "This accusation," I said quietly, "has been rehearsed for a long time." My mother's lips tightened. "You don't have to do this," she said. I rested my hand on the lid of the tin box. "I didn't come tonight to argue," I replied. "I came prepared." And this time, I wasn't defending myself with words. My grandfather didn't believe the story. The words felt steady in my mouth, even though my pulse was pounding in my ears. I lifted the lid of the tin box just enough for the hinges to creak. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence. My grandfather spent the last years of his life trying to understand why the version of my father's death kept changing. I reached inside and removed the first stack of papers. They were neatly clipped together, copies worn slightly at the edges. This had started in 2018. My grandfather, William Bennett, had called me one afternoon and asked me to come by his house. He rarely asked for anything directly. When I walked into his small brick home across town, he was sitting at the kitchen table with documents spread out in front of him. He didn't waste time. "Something isn't lining up," he had said. On the table were hospital discharge summaries, oncology reports, consultation notes from the last month of my father's life. He had requested them legally, as Daniel's father, and as executor at the time. "I kept hearing Caroline say things that don't match these dates," he told me. "Conversations she claims happened on days your father was sedated." He slid one document toward me. It was a signed refusal of aggressive chemotherapy. The paper was unmistakable. My father's handwriting, his signature at the bottom. The date clearly marked. Attached was a physician's confirmation that he was of sound mind when he signed it. I looked up at the dining room now and held up that same document. "This," I said, "is my father's signed statement." I read the key lines aloud. He refused further chemotherapy voluntarily. He understood the prognosis. He made the decision independently. And then the line that mattered most. "My daughter has not influenced this decision in any way." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything my mother had said. Caroline did not deny the signature. Instead, she said, "That doesn't change what he felt." But there was more. I reached back into the box and removed another set of pages. My grandfather didn't stop at hospital paperwork. After my father's diagnosis, he had attended end-of-life counseling sessions provided by the hospital. The therapist's notes were clinical, factual, time-stamped. They documented my father expressing fear, pain, sadness. They also documented him expressing pride in me. Daughter present frequently, relationship described as supportive. No resentment, no mention of pressure, no reference to manipulation. My grandfather had circled those lines in pen. "He loved you," he had told me that day in his kitchen, and he was clear. He had leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. If Caroline is repeating something different, she either misunderstood him or she's rewriting him. Back in the present, Thomas shifted in his seat. "Medical notes don't capture emotion," he said carefully. "No," I replied, "but they capture facts." There was one more page, a handwritten statement my father had added the day he signed the refusal. It was short, personal, his handwriting slightly uneven from pain medication, but legible. "I am choosing quality over length. I do not want my family to suffer watching treatments that will not change the outcome. Olivia supports me as my daughter. This is my decision." I didn't rush when I finished reading it. For 17 years, I had carried the weight of implication. The subtle glances, the careful phrasing. My grandfather had known something was wrong the moment the narrative began to drift from documentation. He had asked one simple question in 2018. "If there was a recording," he had said, "why does none of this mention it?" He searched hospital records for any note of a final audio message. There was none. He asked the attending nurse privately whether any recording had been referenced. It had not. He was too weak at the end to manage something like that alone, the nurse had told him. The room felt smaller now. Evan was staring at the papers like they might rearrange themselves. Caroline's jaw tightened. "These are copies," she said. "They don't prove everything." "They prove he chose," I answered. And for the first time since she had stood up at that table and accused me of killing my father, the certainty in her eyes faltered. "For 17 years, I said quietly, "I carried guilt I never earned." I lowered the pages carefully onto the table. "Tonight," I added, "I'm giving it back." I let the medical records rest on the table for a moment before I reached back into the tin box. "My grandfather didn't just collect evidence," I said. "He prepared for what he believed might happen next." There was a second envelope inside, thicker than the first, sealed with careful precision. My grandfather's handwriting was across the front. I had seen it so many times growing up that I could recognize it from across a room. Caroline's eyes locked onto it immediately. "What is that?" she asked. "You know exactly what it is," I replied. I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. Inside was a stapled packet, a copy of the Living Trust Amendment executed in 2021. "This," I said, holding it up, "is the trust my grandfather created 2 years before he died." A few guests leaned forward instinctively. "The house on Abercorn Street was placed into a living trust," I continued, "and I was named the sole beneficiary of this property." The air in the room shifted again. This was no longer just about grief or memory. This was about inheritance. Thomas straightened in his chair. "That doesn't mean what you think it means," he said carefully. "It means exactly what it says," I replied, flipping to the highlighted section. "The trust includes a forfeiture clause. Any party who spreads knowingly false statements that damage the reputation of the beneficiary forfeits any future interest in estate-related assets." Caroline's face drained of color. "And there's another clause," I added. "Interference with legal correspondence related to the trust can trigger civil liability." Thomas's jaw tightened. I continued before he could interrupt. "After my grandfather passed away in 2022, the estate attorney sent 2 certified letters to this address. Both were signed for. Neither was forwarded to me." A murmur moved through the room. "Certified?" someone asked. "Yes," I said. "Return receipt requested." I turned a page and read from the trust summary. "Failure to notify the named beneficiary of trust activation may constitute obstruction of estate administration." Thomas leaned forward now. "That's an interpretation," he said. "Trusts can be contested. Amendments can be challenged." "They can," I agreed calmly. "If there's evidence of lack of capacity or improper execution, there isn't." The documents were notarized. 2 independent witnesses. Filed properly, recorded. Caroline's voice cut in, thinner than before. "This is about your father, not about money." "You made it about money," I answered. "You implied I wanted insurance more than treatment." Silence answered me. I flipped to the final page and read aloud the language my grandfather had insisted on including. "If any individual knowingly circulates false claims that materially harm the reputation or standing of the beneficiary, said individual shall be excluded from future discretionary considerations of trust-related financial distributions." There were no discretionary distributions left that affected the house. The property was already designated. But the clause mattered. It made intent relevant. It made tonight relevant. "You accused me," I said, meeting my mother's eyes, "of contributing to my father's death, in front of 28 witnesses." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Thomas shifted strategies. "Even if the trust stands," he said, "that doesn't automatically mean this accusation qualifies as defamation." "It doesn't automatically mean it doesn't," I replied. A neighbor across the table spoke softly. "Caroline, is this true? About the letters?" Caroline didn't answer. Instead, she said, "I believed what I said." "That doesn't explain the mail," I said. The question hung between us like a blade. Why were the letters hidden? If she was certain of her version of events, why prevent the legal truth from surfacing? Evan looked from his mother to Thomas and back again. "Mom," he said quietly, "did you know about this?" Caroline's silence was longer this time. I lowered the trust documents to the table beside the medical records. "The house isn't being sold," I said clearly. "It belongs to me." Thomas inhaled slowly, calculating. For years they had relied on implication, on suggestion, on social comfort. Now there were signatures, dates, clauses. For the first time in 17 years, they were the ones without a story, and the room could feel it. No one reached for their food. The turkey cooled under the dining room lights while the trust documents lay spread across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Conversations had dissolved into whispers. Some guests were staring at their plates, others were staring at my mother. Thomas was the first to regain his voice. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said, his tone measured, professional. "Trust language is complex. Clauses don't activate automatically because of emotional disagreement." "Calling your daughter a killer isn't an emotional disagreement," Aunt Marianne said quietly from halfway down the table. The words landed harder than anything I had said. Thomas turned toward her, but she didn't look away. "You accused her of contributing to Daniel's death," she continued. "That's not grief. That's an allegation." Caroline's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "She pressured him," she insisted, though the conviction in her voice had thinned. "She was always talking about plans, about moving away, about building a life somewhere else." He felt abandoned. "I was 15, I said evenly. That reminder moved through the room like a current. Thomas leaned forward, attempting to redirect. "Even if these medical records say Daniel made his own decision," he said, "they don't erase what he might have felt privately." "They erase the claim that I manipulated him," I replied, "and they erase the idea that he left behind a recording blaming me." At that, I looked directly at my mother. "Play it," I said. Her lips parted slightly. "Play the recording." Silence. Evan shifted in his chair. "Mom, you said you had it." Caroline swallowed. "It was years ago. I don't even know where it would be now." "So it existed?" I pressed. She hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. "For 17 years, the existence of that recording had hovered over me like a shadow. It had been detailed enough to be believable, specific enough to discourage questions, but never tangible." "Was there ever a recording?" Evan asked again, softer this time. Caroline didn't look at him. Thomas cleared his throat. "This isn't helping." "It's helping," I said, "because tonight you accused me publicly, not in private, not in whispers, publicly." A neighbor near the end of the table stood slowly and reached for her purse. "I think we should give the family some space," she murmured to her husband. Others followed. The shift wasn't dramatic. No one shouted. No one stormed out in outrage. They simply withdrew. Socially, physically, emotionally. Savannah is not a large city. Reputation moves faster than traffic. And tonight, the accusation had collided with documentation. Caroline set her wineglass down too hard. "You humiliated me," she said to me, her voice low and strained. "You stood up in front of 28 people and said I killed my father," I answered. "You did that." I was telling the truth as I understood it. "You hid the letters," I said. Thomas's eyes flickered at that. "Let's be very clear," I continued. 2 certified letters notifying the beneficiary of a living trust were delivered here. I never received them. That's not misunderstanding. That's control." Thomas leaned back now, the calculation visible. "If you intend to pursue legal action," he said carefully, "you should think about what that does to this family." "I am thinking about this family," I replied. "That's why I'm standing here calmly instead of filing a civil defamation claim tomorrow morning." The word defamation landed with precision. Evan exhaled slowly. "You're saying you could sue?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "For reputational damage. For false public claims. The trust clause strengthens that." Thomas's jaw tightened again. His law license depended on credibility, on integrity. An allegation of obstructing estate correspondence or participating in defamatory conduct would not be small. Caroline looked around the room and seemed to realize something for the first time. No one was nodding in support. No one was defending her. The guests who remained were quiet, observing. "I believed it," she said again, but it sounded weaker now. "Belief doesn't make it true," I said. More guests excused themselves. Plates remained half full. Candles burned down into wax. Eventually the room emptied until only the 4 of us remained: Caroline, Thomas, Evan, and me. The documents still lay on the table. "This isn't over," Thomas said quietly. "No," I agreed, "it's not. But for the first time since my father died, I wasn't the one shrinking under implication. They were the ones calculating consequences. And for the first time in 17 years, I wasn't standing alone." I was awake before sunrise. The house felt different in the gray light of early morning, stripped of its performance. No candles, no voices, no witnesses, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Thomas pacing in the study. The tin box sat on the kitchen table in front of me. For 17 years I had reacted, defended, explained, absorbed. That morning I decided I would act first. I called the estate attorney listed in the trust documents. His name was printed clearly beneath my grandfather's signature. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "I'm calling about the Bennett Trust," I said. "I believe there has been interference." He did not sound surprised. "Yes," he replied after I explained what had happened at Thanksgiving. "The trust was properly executed. It is legally binding. 2 certified letters were delivered to the residence after Mr. Bennett's passing. We have signed receipts." "Signed by whom?" I asked. "Delivered to the property," he clarified carefully. "The signature was not yours." My pulse slowed instead of quickening. This was no longer about memory, it was documentation. "If correspondence was withheld from the named beneficiary," he continued, "that may constitute interference with estate administration, and if defamatory statements were made publicly, that opens a separate avenue." Defamatory. The word had weight. "I'm not looking to destroy anyone," I said. "Understood," he replied, "but you should understand your leverage." When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt anchored. Thomas emerged from the study an hour later. His tie was loosened, though he hadn't left the house. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," I answered. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, not quite meeting my eyes. "Contesting the trust would be difficult," he admitted. "There's no procedural flaw. Your grandfather was of sound mind. It was notarized, witnessed." He paused. "But litigation would damage everyone." "I'm aware," I said. "That's why I'm not filing anything today." He looked up then. "You're not?" "Not if this ends here." He exhaled slowly, calculating outcomes. His law practice relied on reputation. An allegation of obstructing estate correspondence or participating in defamatory behavior could ripple outward in ways he understood better than I did. By afternoon, the social shift had begun. A church friend called to check in. Her tone was cautious but different from years past. A cousin texted to say she had been thinking about the hospital documents all night. Savannah remembers everything. For years, whispers had moved through that same network about my supposed influence over my father's final decision. Now the narrative was reversing. Caroline felt it. She stayed upstairs most of the day. When she finally came down, her face looked older somehow, stripped of its practiced certainty. "I want to talk," she said quietly. We sat in the living room where the accusation had detonated less than 24 hours earlier. "I believed what I said," she began. "He was tired. He was in pain. He talked to you constantly. You thought I convinced him," I finished. She hesitated. "I thought you encouraged acceptance. That's not the same as coercion." Her eyes flickered. "Did you see the signed refusal?" I asked. Another pause. "I saw paperwork," she said carefully. "Did you read it?" Silence. That silence told me more than any confession could. Evan appeared in the doorway later that evening. "I need to say something," he said, looking at the floor. "I always assumed the recording was real. Mom described it so clearly. I never asked to hear it." "It never existed," I said. He swallowed. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words from him cracked something open in the house. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. That night, I walked through the hallway alone and stopped outside my father's study. For 17 years, I had defended myself emotionally. Now the law was on my side. The documents were clear. The trust was valid. The lie was exposed. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was setting terms. And for the first time since I was 15, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. The title transfer became official on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the county clerk's office holding the final paperwork, while the clerk stamped the last page with quiet indifference. There was no dramatic music, no applause, just ink drying on paper that said the house on Abercorn Street now belonged to me. For 17 years, I had lived inside a narrative that painted me as suspect. Now I owned the walls that narrative had been spoken within. Thomas moved out 2 weeks later. He did it efficiently. No arguments, no public scene. A moving truck arrived early in the morning, and by noon his office downstairs was empty. He didn't look at me as he carried the last box to his car. "This shouldn't have been handled like this," he said before closing the door. "You could have stopped it years ago," I replied. He didn't answer. Caroline stayed. The lease agreement my attorney drafted was simple and clinical. 5 years at market rate. Clear payment schedule. 1 additional clause. No further public statements implying wrongdoing on my part regarding Daniel Harper's medical decisions. Any violation would terminate the lease immediately. I slid the document across the kitchen table to her. "This is humiliating," she said softly. "It's structure," I answered. She signed it. A few days later, she asked if we could talk in my father's study. That room had witnessed too much already. The desk where the tin box had been hidden sat in the corner. The leather chair creaked when she lowered herself into it. She didn't look like the woman who had stood at the Thanksgiving table accusing me of killing her husband. She looked smaller, quieter. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. "It went exactly where you steered it," I replied. She pressed her palms together, fingers trembling slightly. "When Daniel refused chemotherapy," she began, "I felt like he was choosing to leave me. I pushed him to reconsider. I told him he had responsibilities. I told him we needed him." I listened without interrupting. "He kept saying he didn't want to spend his last month sick from treatments that wouldn't save him. He said he wanted clarity. He said he wanted time." Her voice cracked. "And you were the only one who didn't argue with him," she added. "You sat there and supported whatever he wanted." "That's what he asked me to do," I said. She nodded slowly. "When he signed those papers," she continued, "I felt helpless. I felt like I had failed him. If it wasn't your influence, then it was my inability to convince him." The words hung there. "Why did you need me to be the villain?" I asked. She closed her eyes. "Because if it wasn't you," she whispered, "then it was me." There it was. Not confusion, not misunderstanding. Guilt redirected. For 17 years, she had reshaped her own pain into a story that made her the betrayed widow instead of the wife who couldn't change the inevitable. "You saw the signed refusal," I said quietly. "You knew he made that choice." She didn't deny it this time. "I couldn't live with the idea that I had no control," she admitted. "Blaming you made it easier." Easier for her. I let the silence stretch between us. "I'm not filing a defamation lawsuit," I said finally. "I'm not forcing you out of the house. But this ends. Completely." She nodded. "If you repeat the accusation publicly again," I continued, "you won't have a lease anymore, and I will pursue legal action." She looked up at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to fear. "I understand," she said. Evan came by later that evening. He stood awkwardly in the hallway, hands in his pockets. "I should have questioned it," he said. "I benefited from the story. I didn't want to look too closely." "Most people don't," I replied. He nodded once and left. That night I walked through the house alone. The living room where the accusation had detonated. The dining table now clear. The hallway where I had once felt erased. For the first time since I was 15, I wasn't carrying someone else's guilt. The lie had finally collapsed under its own weight. And I was still standing. The deed arrived in the mail on a quiet Friday morning. I stood in the foyer of the house on Abercorn Street, holding the envelope in my hands longer than necessary. The paper inside was official, stamped, undeniable. My name where my grandfather had intended it to be. Olivia Bennett, sole owner. There was no applause, no dramatic moment. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the faint scent of lemon cleaner Carolyn had always preferred. Thomas was gone by then. His office downstairs stood empty, shelves cleared, desk removed, as if he had never tried to control what did not belong to him. His departure had been quiet, efficient, strategic. Caroline remained upstairs, now a tenant in a house she once ruled. The first thing I did after reading the deed was walk into the living room. The fireplace mantel had been bare for years. Landscapes, neutral prints, safe choices. My father's photograph had been tucked away in a hallway drawer long ago, replaced by curated art that matched the furniture. I retrieved the frame from the study and placed it in the center of the mantel. He was 39 in the picture, sunlight catching the edge of his smile, a man who had made his own decision about how he wanted to leave this world. I stepped back and let myself breathe. For 17 years, I had been described as the girl who influenced him, the daughter who pushed too hard, the one who cared more about her future than his fight. That label had followed me into rooms I never even knew it entered. And now it was gone. Not erased by shouting, not erased by revenge, erased by documentation. I carried the tin box into the study and sat at my father's old desk. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. I opened the lid one last time and unfolded his handwritten statement. I am choosing quality over length. His words had never blamed me. They had never hinted at regret. They had been deliberate, clear, his. The greatest lie of my life had not just stained my name, it had distorted his autonomy. Tonight, that distortion was over. Outside, Savannah moved as it always did. Church circles whispered, then corrected themselves. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped me on sidewalks to say they were glad the truth had come out. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. But reputation in a southern town shifts like tidewater. Slowly, and then all at once. Caroline kept mostly to herself. She paid rent on time. She did not repeat the accusation. Sometimes I would hear her moving around upstairs and feel a complicated pull in my chest. She was still my mother. That fact did not disappear with a trust clause, but forgiveness is not the same as access. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are architecture. I sat on the back porch that evening, watching the sky turn from gold to indigo the way my father used to. I thought about how easy it would have been to collapse under 17 years of implication. How close I had come at times to believing I might have done something wrong simply because the story was told so often. If you repeat a lie long enough, it can start to feel like memory. But memory does not outrank evidence. Silence does not equal guilt. And grief does not justify rewriting someone else's name. I didn't win by humiliating my mother. I won by refusing to carry what was never mine. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, if someone in your own family rewrote your story because it was easier than facing their own fear, I want you to remember this. Truth doesn't need to scream, it needs to survive. And sometimes survival means patience, documents, and the courage to open the box at the right moment. If this story felt familiar in any way, tell me. Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the first step toward reclaiming your name is simply saying it out loud. And if you believe in protecting dignity, in setting boundaries without destroying yourself, stay here. There are more stories about family betrayal, hidden power, and reclaiming what was almost taken. Subscribe if you want to hear them. For 17 years, I carried a lie that was never mine. Tonight, I finally set it down. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact,